Chapter 1. The Call of Moses. Between palace shadow and desert dawn. In the scorching sands of the Sinai Desert, where the relentless wind carried only the echoes of long-forgotten generations, Moses was a simple shepherd tending the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro. These were not merely 40 years of exile. They were a period of sacred purification, a transforming crucible where the former Egyptian prince, once familiar with the weight of gold and the arrogance of power, became a humble herdsman who knew only the weight of his staff and the dangers of the mountain trails. His soul, once torn between two worlds, Egyptian splendor and Hebrew sorrow, had found a deceptive peace in this boundless silence. He thought he had fled destiny, concealing his history behind the yellow dunes to avoid an overwhelming responsibility. But the tranquility of nature was precisely the deception. For destiny does not ask permission. It waits until its chosen one is ready. And so, at the foot of the sacred Mount Horeb, where the air felt particularly charged, the silence was shattered abruptly and catastrophically. Moses saw it. It was not a common heat-induced combustion or a lightning strike. It was a self-denying fire, a flame that burned yet did not consume. The thorny bush stood in a blazing golden-red halo against the gray stones, yet never turned to ash. This was a violation of physical law, an intervention of the transcendent into the realm of the temporal. Moses, a man of the desert, understood fire, and for that very reason, a sacred, paralyzing panic seized him. As he cautiously drew nearer, compelled by an irresistible curiosity, a voice resonated from within the unconsumed flame. It was neither the intimidating sound of thunder, nor the seductive whisper of the wind. It was a sound so pure and primal, so potent and personal, that it penetrated the marrow of his bones, dissolving his doubt and exposing his fear. "Moses! Moses!" it echoed. The clear personal appeal by his name tore through the veil of 40 years of solitude. And Moses' first instinctive reaction, schooled in the reverence of gods, was to fall prostrate. The voice resonated again, placing upon him the burden he had so long evaded. "Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Removing the sandals meant casting off the dust of the world and acknowledging oneself as one entering the sphere of the Absolute. And then, Moses heard the greatest mystery articulated in words. "I am Yahweh. I am who I am, the existing one." This was not the name of a sun god or a river god. It was the proclamation of pure, eternal, immutable being. Pharaoh, who considered himself a god, was only a transient ruler over sand. But this was the voice of the one who stands outside of time. And then the command, simple as a breath and heavy as mountains. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning. I have come down to rescue them. Go now and bring my people out." Suddenly, Moses the shepherd became the intermediary between eternity and history. All his past actions, his knowledge, even his act of killing the Egyptian, took on a new, terrifying significance. Now, he had to go back to where he was a criminal, to the palace where he was a prince, to the people he had abandoned, back to lead them into the unknown. His heart sank as he realized the peace of the desert was an illusion, and true life awaited him in the crucible of battle. He felt not just fear of Pharaoh, but a metaphysical terror of his own destiny. Chapter 2. Signs and Scruples. The intermediary's psychological battle. God promised Moses not only strength, but his very self. The unconsumed burning bush was just the beginning, a visual confirmation of the impossible. Yet, this sign did not eliminate the weight of Moses' human doubts. On the contrary, it only emphasized the terrible chasm between the grandeur of the calling and his own insignificance. "Who am I, Lord, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out?" His words were not merely an excuse, but the cry of a soul aware of its frailty. His doubts were multi-layered, like a pyramid: self-doubt, his difficulty speaking, his stutter, his former status as a fugitive murderer, doubt in the people. They will not believe me. They will ask, "What is his name?" And doubt in the task itself. Fear of Pharaoh was not fear of a man, but fear of embodied idolatrous power, the God King. He knew that Pharaoh's heart was of stone, and that the darkness of slavery had so enveloped the spirit of the Israelites that they no longer desired freedom, but only the guaranteed ration. And so God, with a love that knows no rejection, yet a demand that knows no compromise, gave Moses signs. These were not mere tricks for the crowd, but psychological tools meant to convince, first and foremost, Moses himself. "What is that in your hand?" the voice asked. The shepherd's staff, a symbol of his peaceful, fugitive life, instantly transformed into a deadly, hissing serpent. Moses, frightened and recoiling, received his first lesson. The simplest tool in the hand of faith becomes an instrument of cosmic power. He had to grasp the snake by the tail, immersing his hand in the realm of risk, to restore it to the form of wood. The second sign was even more personal and gruesome. God commanded him to put his hand into his cloak. When Moses drew it out, it was white as snow, afflicted with terrible, deadly leprosy. This was a visualization of what might befall his people if he did not intervene, and a reminder of his own mortality. When the hand was restored to health, Moses understood. The power that inflicts disease can grant healing. The power that brings death also brings life. Despite these signs, his doubt about eloquence persisted. "Oh, my Lord, I am not a man of words." This statement concealed not only a speech impediment, but a deeper fear, the fear of speaking truth to power. God rebuked him. "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Is it not I, the Lord?" This was the final argument. If God commands him to speak, he will also provide the words. But, seeing his servant's stubbornness, he made a final, merciful compromise. Aaron, his brother, would become his mouth, his voice. From this moment, Moses accepted his destiny. He was chosen not for his strength, but for his weakness, which allowed divine strength to operate through him. He received the task, the staff, the name of God, and a brother. Filled with grim determination, not triumph, he left the mountains. He was not going toward freedom, but toward the greatest confrontation in history. His path led to the heart of darkness, where Pharaoh awaited him. Chapter 3: Perversion and Resistance. The clash of two wills in the marble halls. Moses, armed only with a simple shepherd's staff and the great and singular name, stood before Pharaoh in his marble halls, where the air was heavy with incense and the walls shimmered with gold. It was a clash of two realities: the grandeur of the desert and the grandeur of the empire, the voice of eternity and the whisper of hubris. Moses presented himself not as a supplicant, nor as a slave, but as an emissary, the herald of God, whose appearance, despite his humble dress, radiated authority. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Aaron's voice thundered, amplified by Moses' spirit, shattering the palace silence. Pharaoh, seated on his throne, adorned with the symbols of Ra and Amun, felt not fear, but only wrath. Who was this Yahweh, and why should he obey him? Pharaoh was a god on earth, the living embodiment of divinity. His heart was hardened, not because God compelled him, but because he chose his will to be the supreme and only will. His response was laced with contempt. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. These words were not merely a refusal, but a declaration of war against heaven. Pharaoh embodied the human arrogance that refuses to acknowledge any authority superior to its own. He saw in Moses only a rebellious slave who dared to interrupt his divine tranquility. Moses' initial signs, such as the staff turning into a snake, were met with mockery. The Egyptian magicians could do the same, albeit with less power. This was the triumph of illusion over reality, and it only strengthened Pharaoh in his obstinacy. His wrath and stubbornness escalated, and he answered the call to freedom with a terrible new irony. Not only did he refuse to release them, but he doubled the burden of slavery. You are lazy. You talk of your gods because you have nothing to do. From now on, do not provide straw for them. Let them gather it themselves, and the quota of bricks remains unaltered. This was a perversion that inflicted a double blow upon the Israelites. Physical, the labor became unbearable, and psychological, they hated Moses. The very people for whom he had returned vented their fury on him, accusing him of worsening their fate. May the Lord look upon you and judge. You have made us repulsive in the sight of Pharaoh. Moses, devastated, returned to God with a cry. Why did you send me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has only brought more trouble on this people, and you have not rescued them. This was the climax of the intermediary psychological drama. The man who brings light temporarily only brings deeper darkness. But it was in this moment of despair that God revealed himself anew, confirming his covenant with Abraham and promising that this time he would manifest his power not just as the God of the covenant, but as the warrior redeemer. The tension reached its limit. The battle of wills was over, and it was time for the battle of might. Chapter 4: The 10 Plagues, Catastrophe, and the Ruin of the Theological Empire. The confrontation moved to a phase of grand sequential catastrophe, aimed not only at punishing Egypt, but at demonstrating the impotence of its gods and proving to the Israelites that their Yahweh was the one true and existing being. Each plague was surgically precise, targeting the very foundations of Egyptian faith and civilization. Water turned to blood. The first strike fell upon the symbol of life, pride, and deity in Egypt, the Nile. The life-giving river, the embodiment of the god Hapi, turned into a lethal, foul-smelling substance. Fish died, the river reeked, and Pharaoh's priests, who worshipped the Nile, drank the repulsive, bloody liquid. This was the first physical and deeply symbolic humiliation of Pharaoh's power. His river god was not only powerless, but became a source of suffering. Attack of frogs. Frogs, associated in Egyptian mythology with the fertility goddess Heket, who had a frog's head, invaded everything. They came up from the Nile, entered houses and courtyards, settling in beds, ovens, and vessels. This was disorder and uncleanness that destroyed the cleanliness and order of Egyptian life, showing that the goddess of fertility could only bring chaos. Insects and small animals, gnats, lice, and flies. Invisible gnats, lice, and persistent flies, covering people and livestock, were a blow to the purity of the Egyptian priests, who were obsessed with hygiene. This was a disaster that Pharaoh's wise men's magical powers could no longer replicate. They were forced to admit, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh refused to listen. Wild wind brought disease to livestock, pestilence. A deadly plague struck the Egyptian livestock, affecting not only the economy, but also the deities represented in animal form, e.g., the god Apis bull. This plague, for the first time, drew a clear and unbreakable line. The Israelite livestock remained untouched. Disaster manifested in sores and suffering, boils and blisters. Moses tossed ash toward the sky, causing painful boils on people and animals. This was a direct mockery of the Egyptian healing gods, who could not protect even the priests themselves. The suffering became personal, unbearable. Thunder and hail destroyed fields and crops. The sky, which the Egyptians considered their sanctuary, rebelled against them. God manifested his power over the forces of nature, over the sky goddess Nut and the weather god Shu. Thunder and hail destroyed fields and crops. But again, in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, calm and sun reigned. The devouring locust, only after the 7th plague. Pharaoh, who had almost let the people go after the hail, grew furious again. Locusts, a vast, countless army, arrived from the east to devour what little remained in the fields. This was a complete economic collapse that even his servants begged him to stop. Darkness covered the country for 3 days. This plague was the deepest psychological blow. 3 days of palpable, dense, paralyzing darkness engulfed Egypt, negating the very sun god, Ra, the greatest deity of the empire. People could not see, could not move. They were imprisoned in their houses, as if in stone tombs. Meanwhile, in Goshen, light prevailed. This was a clear, visible separation, emphasizing that the God of Israel is the Lord of both light and darkness, death of the firstborn, the last and most terrible. This plague was not merely economic or natural, but metaphysical, a retribution for the firstborn of Israel drowned in the Nile. Moses proclaimed, "About midnight, the Lord will go throughout Egypt, and every firstborn son in Egypt will die." This was a strike at the future, at hope, at Pharaoh's own heir, who was considered a divine son. Triumph of faith over arrogance and evil. This final plague was not just death, but the triumph of the will of the one who is. Pharaoh's heart, which withstood all previous plagues, finally broke not out of fear, but out of personal, irreparable grief. His arrogance fell along with his son. This was the total defeat of human self-exaltation before the justice of God. Chapter 5. Passover and Deliverance. The night of the boundary and the dawn of freedom. The night of the Passover was a night when time stood still. The tension between life and death, between bondage and freedom, reached its climax. The Israelites, following meticulous instructions, celebrated the Passover, sensing the power of God's providence that had finally manifested physically. The blood of the lamb, smeared on the doorposts, was not just a sign. It was the line of the covenant, a visible boundary set between them and the angel of death. In great haste, standing with unleavened bread, staffs in hand, they consumed this last meal in slavery, the bread of affliction and the memory of liberation. Their hearts pounded between the wild fear of the terrible event imminently approaching and an elevated, almost frantic hope. They knew that, On this night, their destiny was being decided in heaven and on earth. And precisely at midnight, as the Egyptian empire fell into the deepest, most oppressive silence, a cry went up. It was not a single cry, but a million shrieks of pain that rose from every Egyptian house, from the slaves' hovel to Pharaoh's marble halls. Death, invisible, relentless, and irreversible, took the firstborn of every family, including the heir to the throne. Meanwhile, the lamb's blood on the Israelite doorposts served as an insurmountable shield. Pharaoh's fury was restrained not by force, but by pain. His arrogance, which had resisted all previous plagues, finally broke before the corpse of his own son. He, who considered himself a god, was forced to acknowledge a higher authority. Pharaoh, utterly broken and beside himself, ordered them to leave. He begged them to leave his country, taking not only their people, but their blessing with them. Israel set out. It was not a peaceful march, but a great, chaotic, unstoppable exodus. 600,000 men, not counting women, children, and a great mix of various people who joined them, left Egypt. They walked, loaded with gold, silver, and precious stones that the Egyptians, driven by fear, handed over to them. This was the payment for 400 years of unpaid slavery, settled in a single night. Finally, the time of freedom arrived. A time when, instead of slave labor, they were guided by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, the direct physical presence of God pointing the way. Their hearts pounded between the euphoria of liberation and the fear of the unknown. Slavery was over, but the path to the promised land was just beginning. They left the land that had become a tomb for them and headed into the desert to attest to the formation of a free, unified nation. But the first obstacle, the Red Sea, already awaited them, and behind them, in rabid fury, rushed Pharaoh's chariots, who quickly regretted their decision to let the slaves go. This was the beginning of the greatest drama, which would conclude not only with the physical exodus, but with the birth of the law.